Before we get into the intro today, I have to tell you guys about this awesome chance to save some money on the upcoming Pacific Bitcoin Festival happening on October 5th and 6th out in Los Angeles. If you click the link below in the show notes, you get a 21% discount on the event tickets. And the best part is you don't even have to worry about remembering a promo code because the link will automatically apply the discount at checkout. Guys, I have to say that honestly, this might be one of the better events to be going to this year, because not only will you be surrounded people like Lynn Alden, Greg Foss, Preston Pish, etc., but this one is actually one of those affordable events in the space that you can go to where it's not going to cost you thousands of dollars just to get a ticket like some of the other Bitcoin events. So go and click the link below, get your tickets to Pacific Bitcoin, and when you do, please reach out to me. I'd love to hang out with you guys in person. I'd love to get a real-life happy hour set up to chat and hang out with you guys more. So I hope that I can see you guys there. Hey everyone, welcome to this week's release of the Hashrate Happy Hour Podcast. We have another really special episode. Today I'm joined by both Evan Neel and Agee Springer of ERCOT. We spent some time talking through who ERCOT is, the scale of the grid compared to the total capacity of Bitcoin mining that they are actually aware of, and we wrap up the conversation with some of the potential challenges that are presented by this much flexible load on the grid system. This is an absolutely phenomenal perspective, completely removed from the Bitcoin mining industry, to hear about how ERCOT is directly impacted by these large flexible loads such as Bitcoin mining. Today's podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, the Texas Blockchain Council, a Bitcoin-first nonprofit industry organization working to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin mining and blockchain innovation. They will be hosting North America's premier policy conference for Bitcoin and the digital asset ecosystem on November 15th through the 17th in Fort Worth, Texas. For more information, please visit their website at texasblockchaincouncil.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Like I said in the introduction, this is a super exciting episode. I have Agee Springer and Evan Neel, sorry guys, with ERCOT on to talk all things power and the Texas grid. So guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can state it, enough how excited I am to have this discussion with you guys. I really appreciate you guys carving out some time. It's a Friday, it's the afternoon. We're going to nerd out over all things large load. So appreciate it, guys. Most episodes I like to have the guest, kind of walk through their backgrounds. I think that helps paint just a nice backdrop for the rest of the discussion. I would love to get your guys' backgrounds, and maybe Agee, we start with you and walk us through your background and what fascinates you so much about electricity and what brought you to ERCOT, and then we can follow up with Evan.
Thanks again for having us. My name is Agee Springer, and I'll actually maybe start by answering your last question there. What draws me to electricity? I think there's two aspects. The nerd in me enjoys the problem solving aspect. Really, power systems are generally just big puzzles, and solving them is keeping them running is very satisfying. And then the other piece of it is a sort of public good benefit of reliable electricity, reliable energy. I think is important. For society at large. So being able to do something that is really fun for me personally, but also provides societal good, I think is kind of a win-win there. I've been with ERCOT for about 10 years, with a break in the middle for a couple of years when I was with a renewable developer. I started as an engineer providing real-time support to the ERCOT control room. So doing things like reliability studies, analysis when we had grid events, and just supporting the control room operators with whatever they needed to maintain grid reliability. It also included things like development of control room displays to help improve their awareness of the system. I've been an engineer in ERCOT's market analysis and validation team, which looks at many of the same issues, but from the market side. So price formation, analyzing market participant behavior, and just really making sure that the market is functioning as intended, which is to promote grid reliability. I've been the supervisor of ERCOT's engineer development program for new engineers entering the company and just starting their careers. And then currently I serve as the manager of large load interconnection, which is a brand new team that is being formed to address the sort of large wave of new and large and flexible loads that are connecting to the system for the first time, that are really bringing a large amount of change and some new reliability challenges I think we'll talk some more about. So we're starting up a completely new team to address those challenges, and that's probably a good segue to Evan, who is just joining our team.
Sure, yeah. So let's see. I'm pretty new out of college, so I graduated in 2020 from Duke University. I studied mechanical engineering there, and I was really just kind of figure out what I wanted to do. Was very interested in like energy, power. Wasn't sure if I really wanted to go to the generation side. I had a short stint at an internship at an asset management company in Charlotte. Really enjoyed that. But upon graduating, I just found myself really fascinated with the bulk electric system as a whole, just how intricate a puzzle that is. And Agee kind of alluded to this, but just the engineering challenge to balance all aspects of that, from planning to operations to markets, bringing in generation, bringing the load side. It's just one of those unique engineering problems that I think not many people are lucky enough to work on it, from my perspective. So I then joined ERCOT in 2020. I actually went through that engineering development program that Agee used to be the supervisor of. So that gave me a good, well-rounded experience to start off, touching on all those different groups, from markets to planning to operations. And from there, then I pivoted over into our resource adequacy team. So I've been there for about 2 years. And resource adequacy is essentially a derivative of the planning department. And you're looking at, into the future, whether or not supply is going to meet demand, and you're doing a bunch of studies related to that. And around the same time, I kind of got interested in Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, and recognized it kind of as a similar, very large, intricate puzzle with all the terms that come together there.
Yeah.
And began to sort of recognize, that relationship between Bitcoin mining and then the energy space. And it just so happened to line up around when the China ban happened. I believe that was 2021. And we started seeing miners move to Texas and to ERCOT, that things kind of started to gain traction here. And so I took that opportunity to really jump on that. Worked on any project I could, did a bunch of informational sessions within the company on that, and just trying to be as involved as I could as possible. And so now Agee came back to ERCOT, and he's heading up this new large load team. And I'll actually be the first FTE working under him, so that'll be official next week. So there's your transition.
I'm just looking forward to not being the only person full time dealing with this.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. That it's super helpful to just paint that backdrop. All right, so I have to ask Agee, when Evan started to bring up things like Bitcoin mining as a large flexible load, what were your first thoughts to that? And maybe just even on top of that, were you aware of Bitcoin? Did you know what Bitcoin mining was? Was that on your radar?
Well, it certainly was by the time I came back, and started this particular role. But I'll just freely admit that Evan's level of knowledge is probably an order of magnitude greater than mine. I think I've become much more familiar with the concept of proof of work, and how the sort of rudimentary mechanics of Bitcoin mining. But for me as an electricity nerd, I think a lot of my focus and expertise is much more on how they impact and interact with the grid, and it's really important to understand kind of what's going on behind the electricity meter, but I'm certainly not an expert.
Oh, that's okay. I'm not an expert either. It's still a very nascent industry in general. I'd be curious though, was there like a moment where it clicked? Was it like when you were listening to the functionality of Bitcoin mining where you're like, wow, that may be a pretty like good tool for the grid? Or did you have any moment like that or anything like that at all?
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that the nature of Bitcoin mining can be flexible because it doesn't really have any intermediate product. So I think, you know, there's I think there's a lot of evidence that flexible loads in general are going to become an important tool um, for the management of the grid over the next 10 years. It's really a kind of a transformational period. And so to the extent that Bitcoin mining can fit into those parameters, and I think we'll probably talk about them,
Yes.
during our conversation. I think that does have the potential to be an asset to grid operation and reliability if it's done in a coordinated way. So yeah, I mean, there's certainly a recognition that Bitcoin has that potential. I wouldn't say it's the only type of load that does.
Okay.
Though.
Yeah, and I agree 100% wholeheartedly on that last statement that it's not the only thing. All right, so Evan, I got to scratch this itch a little bit more. When you first were like, "Hey, Bitcoin mining," and then bringing it through with ERCOT, how was it initially received? And then, I mean, obviously, here we are. We're talking about it. You guys are looking at it. How was it in the beginning, and then how did you get to where we are today with the discussion?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, to kind of build off what Agee said, and this kind of predated before he came back. But we actually had a separate engineer who was really tracking all of these projects that were just kind of popping up all over Texas. And I was just kind of like, oh, 100 megawatts here, 100 megawatts there. And eventually it's like, oh, we have, a fairly good sized city essentially that wants to connect in under 2 years. This doesn't really fit in with our traditional planning processes. We don't really know how this load's going to behave. So frankly, it kind of raised some alarms, right?
Yeah, I can imagine.
Saw that, yeah, and you saw that within the ERCOT stakeholder system. So they formed a task force called the Large Flexible Load Task Force, and a bunch of market participants basically got together with ERCOT, and we're like, okay, guys, so here are all the issues, problems, potential things we could run into that we basically just need to come up with solutions for. Because it's our duty to serve the load. We're not gatekeeping the grid by any means. It's just like we mentioned before, another engineering challenge that was presented to us. And so that process is still being worked on today, right? But I think since then to now, there's been a lot of education on both sides. We've had these loads on the system for longer, so we've been able to get more observational data under our belt. We're learning more on how they behave in terms of their flexibility, what signals they respond to. So it's a continuous, learning situation. I think it's a lot of back and forth where it's like, oh, this would be a really cool potential for it, at least from my perspective. And then it's like, oh, well, here's this problem that we haven't really considered yet that we need to tackle to make sure everything, comes together and is coordinated and we maintain reliability.
I thank you for going a little deeper on that for me. Like I said, it's an itch I had to scratch. I came from 3M, and one of the things I had tried to kick around internally was, an initiative of sorts around the Bitcoin mining ecosystem, and I ran into a little bit more of a barrier there than you did. So again, it's kind of an itch I wanted to scratch because I am just curious on how more established, more traditional, agencies and groups are starting to come around to this crazy thing called Bitcoin mining. So thank you. Appreciate that. I think it would be a shame if I did not ask the question, who is ERCOT? What does ERCOT do? How are you doing it? I'm up in Minnesota. We're a totally different grid system than ERCOT. So please help me get a better understanding of this.
Yeah. So yeah, you already alluded to a little bit of the first part, that so Texas is the ERCOT grid is essentially the Texas grid. It doesn't quite cover all of Texas. There's a little bit in the east and El Paso in the west that are part of different interconnections. But for the majority of Texas's land mass and customers are a separate electric grid from the rest of the United States. And ERCOT is the grid operator for that grid. So what does that really mean?
Yeah.
It's our official title is the independent system operator. So you can kind of think of us like a air traffic controller, but for electricity. So just like the air traffic controller doesn't own any planes or airports or runways, but it has the bird's eye view of the whole system and make sure everything runs reliably. ERCOT has the same function for electricity in the state of Texas. We don't operate generators. We don't own generators. We don't own transmission lines. We don't directly serve customers, but we have a bird's eye view of the whole thing, and we kind of perform some core reliability functions. So we operate the system day to day from our control room, because there, a number of different companies operate different pieces of the system. So you need an entity that's coordinating everything and making sure it operates reliably. We also operate the energy market. Now, the energy markets are structured to promote reliability, and ERCOT is the operator of the market, not a participant in the market. And so, we kind of function as that bird's eye view, honest broker that doesn't have a stake in it. We ensure that there's open access to the transmission system. And we also kind of facilitate a competitive retail market. So, at a very high level, we're kind of, we're maintaining the reliability of the whole system by, ensuring an even playing field and functioning as that entity that is dedicated towards just maintaining reliability.
Okay. I think another point, and I think we can get to it through a question, is you guys are not setting power rates. You're not setting rate structures. You guys, and I ask that because, again, totally different grid system up here on MISO. Mm-hmm. I'm in Minnesota. I've got the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission, where their mandate is to protect me, the consumer, from, monopolies, basically, of the utilities. So that's not you guys, right?
No, ERCOT operates the wholesale electricity market, but then we do not set retail rates, and we don't have direct relationships with individual customers either.
Okay, when you say wholesale, maybe just help me understand that.
Sure. So the wholesale market essentially is the portion that would function between the sale of energy from the generators that are connected to the transmission system, the transmission of energy across the transmission system, and then the purchase of energy by what are called load serving entities. And those are entities that are purchasing power at a wholesale rate and then reselling them to individual customers or blocks of individual customers through what are called retail electric providers. And those would be the entities that would be your local utility, or there are portions of Texas that are deregulated and have electricity competition for individual customers. So you can purchase an electricity plan kind of like you can a cell phone plan in some areas of the state. And then other areas are still, municipal or co-op, and those are much more the traditional regulated
sure.
rates.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Some I'm sure there will be plenty more rudimentary questions coming.
Just as long as you're not asking me to explain Bitcoin in too much detail, I think.
Yeah, no, that's all good. Let's maybe talk about like the scale of ERCOT, because again, you guys are. I mean, the state of Texas is the scale of the size of this state is alarming. So I'd actually be curious. Do you guys know, like, what's the size of your total system, and maybe just to compare that to some of the other states or grids?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly give you some kind of quick facts about our system. So we serve about 90% of Texas's electric load, and about 75% of Texas's land mass. So there's some good portions out in West Texas that aren't in ERCOT's region, but they're also very sparsely populated. We've been setting summer peak records all summer. So our most recent peak was on August 10th, and it was about 85,000 megawatts. And to give you some sense of context, last year's peak load was about 80,500 megawatts. So we've added almost 5,000 megawatts on last year's record just this summer, which both gives you a sense of how much the state is growing and how hot it has been here this summer. So in terms of just the physical size too, we've got about 52,000 miles of transmission lines crisscrossing the state, and about 1,100 generating units are connected. And some of those are quite small. Other those range up to a big nuclear plant and everything in between. So it's relative to the rest of the United States, there's, both the Eastern interconnection and then the Western interconnection, which are obviously much larger systems because they cover
states in there. Yeah.
The Eastern interconnection runs from the East Coast basically through the Dakotas. And then the Western interconnection goes, from there on west, and then Texas is a third grid. So, it really gives you a sense of scale there that, Texas is actually quite small relative to those other grids. And it's only one state, but the fact that it's electrically quite small actually means that issues like the addition of these larger loads, they become operating challenges here first because the grid is smaller. So if we start adding thousands of megawatts of new large loads relative to the size of the grid, that's actually a fairly significant fraction. And within another state it might be, but because that state is interconnected with many other states, it's not as noticeable early on. Whereas in ERCOT, we really start to have to grapple with those reliability challenges.
Sure.
Pretty quickly.
Okay, I appreciate the scale on that, and maybe to further add an understanding of the scale. Do you happen to have figures on the visible amounts of Bitcoin mining on your system, like as far as like a total number of megawatts on the system?
Yeah, so one thing to clarify there, right, is ERCOT as an entity doesn't have any visibility into what the load is actually doing with their power, right? We just see an entity interconnecting for X amount of megawatts, and maybe we know if it's like commercial, industrial, residential, that kind of thing. But whether or not it's going to be a Bitcoin mining load is really unknown to us, unless maybe the customer reaches out directly and talks to us through this large load interconnection process. Or it's pretty easy to read the news and see a huge load going up in whatever county. You can connect the dots. So what we do is we don't have tracking of Bitcoin mining specifically. We just have tracking of large loads. And so currently that is going to be a load that is going to plan to be greater than 75 megawatts and interconnect within a span of 2 years or less. So that definitely fits the bill for Bitcoin miners, but it's not all Bitcoin miners. You have to consider that Bitcoin miners might be, anywhere below that. So we're not going to have visibility on that. But in terms of a load quantity that we've approved for large loads coming on is roughly just under 3 gigawatts right now.
Oh, wow.
So 3,000 megawatts. Yes, I mean, so it's a considerable amount, and keep in mind that's the amount that we've approved to connect. It's not the amount that we've seen. The amount that we've seen a non-coincident peak. So this is just taking each individual load's peak amount and then summing all that up. That is roughly 2,300 megawatts as of today.
Yeah, and I would add that that is the amount that has interconnected or been approved to interconnect since January of 2022. And so if you look at that 2,900 megawatts or just slightly less than 3 gigawatts, that represents about 3.5% of that overall summer peak record that I just mentioned that we hit last week. So, that's to add 3.5% to your load in a year and a half. I mean, that's a pretty fast ramp up of load.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to highlight that piece, Evan, where, you guys don't have the ability to go in and say, okay, these electrons are going into a Bitcoin miner. I think that's really important because I think the narrative out there is like, well, ERCOT knows exactly how much Bitcoin mining's on their grid, and all you got to do is call them up and ask. No, it's not quite that way at all. So I appreciate that, Evan. Let's maybe go a little bit deeper on some of your guys' programs. You guys do have a couple different programs, things like demand response, firm fuel supply, QSE, renewable credits. Well, maybe not. And that one, I'm, a little fuzzy on that one. So please, walk me through, in whatever fashion you feel like some of those programs.
Yeah, I mean, so we can start with demand response, right? Because we're talking about Bitcoin miners. That's the big one. And so demand response is more of a broad term, right? There isn't like an ERCOT demand response program. There are programs that ERCOT has that are what you would call demand response if you're going to describe it. And so this can range from anything from ancillary services to this thing called 4CP, which stands for 4 coincident peaks. And that's actually not an ERCOT thing. That's a Public Utility Commission thing. It's basically a way for them to set their rate structure there. So all of ERCOT, really, we just calculate the numbers and pass it on to the PUC, and then that is entirely their thing. But it affects Bitcoin miners all the same. And then you just have your basic price responsive action, right? These guys are responding to wholesale market prices, so they're going to do what's in their best economic interest, right? So we can start with ancillary services. Okay, let's ERS. Yeah, so ERS is I guess you could say a fourth one. You kind of think it's similar to an ancillary service. It's the emergency response service.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is a contractual service that ERCOT has. There's a X amount of budget set aside, and ERCOT basically calculates for each hour of the year how much of this service you need. And it's essentially, in the case of emergencies, it's an amount of load or generation set aside that ERCOT can call on, right? So this is once we hit an advisory, so what's called the Physical Response Capability, PRC, which high level you can think of is like a measure of the grid's health, right? You want to keep the PRC at a healthy level. So once that drops below 3,000, our operators are able to call on that at their discretion, right? So these pre-contracted companies, it could be small generators, small loads, Bitcoin mines, LFLs, whatever. They'll call on them and say, hey, we are deploying ERS at this time. And that's when they'll shut off their load, turn on their emergency generator, whatever they were contracted for. And so that is a paid service, right? That is competitively procured. So market participants will bid to provide that service, and there will be a clearing price on that. So it'll take the lowest bidders.
Yeah, and I think it's important to really emphasize there that that's open to any load all of these services are open to any load that can demonstrate that they meet the qualification requirements. It has nothing to do with how they're using their end use electricity. It's really, an ERS is really the most accessible kind of program to loads that wish to provide a service to the grid and
okay. And you mentioned that there are some things they have to do to qualify for it. What are those?
Um, yeah, so I mean, when we talk about qualification, I think that is more going to apply towards ancillary
Hmm.
services. There are qualifications for ERS, but it's much less stringent, right? You really just kind of need a meter and a queasy for the most part. So when we're talking about ancillary services,
Yeah.
these are less of an emergency tool for ERCOT and more
Okay.
of a reliability tool. So you have a couple of them. So the main ones that LFLs are participating in is going to be your responsive reserve service. So that's your RRS. It's going to be your non-spin reserve service. And then there's going to be your ERCOT contingency reserve service, so ECRS. And these are all basically different variations of having capacity set aside. So this could be capacity from a load or generator for ERCOT operators to basically call upon when the situation's right. So there's operating guides that go deep into the specifications on when things can be dispatched. But essentially, you can think of these as tools to primarily deal with frequency
Mm.
issues, right? So if you look at RRS, for example, if you have something like a nuclear unit trip off, you just lost a considerable amount of megawatts on the system, and you're going to need to balance that out in some way. So that would be an example of where an operator could dispatch RRS, or in this case ECRS, and that could either bring more generation online to replace what was lost, or you would then do the opposite side of that equation is take load off to
Sure.
match what
Um,
generation was missing.
yeah,
So
sorry to jump in.
yeah, go ahead.
Which is more preferred? Like either like a peaker plant spinning up or a load coming off. What is there a preference on that?
So the preference is, the responsibility of ERCOT is to procure these services at the lowest cost. So there is a limit in the ERCOT protocols on how much of these services can come from load, but beyond that, it's just whichever is the most economical bids. Those are the ones that clear the market and are awarded the responsibility to provide this service. So we the services are procured in the day ahead market. So there's a competitive bidding process. The lowest bids are the ones that clear, and then those either loads or generators that were awarded have a responsibility when we get to the awarded time period in the next operating day. They have the responsibility to reserve that capacity to provide the
Okay.
service.
I guess the next question that comes to mind then is like, as far as who you guys might be seeing is becoming more and more competitive on that, are you seeing a particular actor? I guess what I'm asking, I'll just ask it outright. Are you seeing Bitcoin mining operators becoming the most competitive on that type of service, or no?
So I mean, it's really hard to say who's the most competitive in that service, right? Because you have a lot of players, right? Any generation that can provide it, any different type of load that can provide it. But you have to kind of back up a step and say, who actually can provide these services.
Mm-hmm.
There is a qualification process, and based on those three that I said, so RRS, non-spin, and ECRS, there are different levels of qualification you have to go through in terms of flexibility. How much you control your load. Being able to provide primary frequency response is a big one. And so essentially, being able to do these things is what you would qualify as is called a load resource. And then there are two different categories of load resources. There is your non-controllable load resource, which you can just kind of think about a chunk load that's got an under frequency relay system, right? So they can just turn it off and on. And then your controllable load resource. And this would be, your traditional flexible load that can ramp up and down to a
Mm-hmm.
signal. Okay. And, back to how large flexible loads would come and impact that, granted they're able to qualify for those, they could, just bid in to these programs. And if you're a load, and let's just take Bitcoin mining, for example, and you have, your way to make money through mining, right, of consuming power, you just kind of have to play the economics there to decide, whether or not you want an ancillary service obligation to, I mean, because that means you have to be online, you have
Yeah.
to be consuming energy to be available to ramp down to provide that service if needed. So, um, there are, different times of the day, depending on power prices, when maybe Bitcoin miners would want to or not want to. But in general, if you think about what it would cost them to provide the ancillary service, most of the time it's going to be nothing, right? They want to stay online, granted that they think power prices are going to stay below their strike price. And it doesn't really cost them anything extra to have an obligation to stay online. So you would think in that situation that they would bid $0 to provide that service. And so anytime that you have an industry coming in, and keep in mind, it's not just Bitcoin miners, it could be other people as well. If you're just bidding zero into that service, you're effectively lowering the clearing price for that service, right? So you can see that. And I think that's what you would just see most in these sorts of markets as they mature, right? And you get technology coming onto the grid that just kind of matches up with that service. You're just going to see a more competitive market in general.
This just shows my level of understanding of it all. Is that a benefit to either the citizens or the grid, like that type of activity? Is that a net benefit?
Well, if it's going to clear at a lower price, then in theory you do have less cost on consumers, right? It would lower the cost.
And again, I was just curious. I mean, I'll probably bug you guys for like a follow-up meeting off the podcast just to continue my education on all of this. Again, this is quite a bit different and quite a bit more in depth than I'm used to. So I might be a little over my head on this all, but
well, I mean, if we could explain the intricacies of the ancillary service market structure in an hour podcast, we would probably we would probably be considered wizards. But I just want to emphasize one other thing that Evan said. That lowering the cost of procuring ancillary services that's assuming that the Bitcoin, if there are Bitcoin miners entering the bidding pool, that they're bidding at a lower price than it would otherwise have cleared at. So it's not a guarantee that their participation would lower the clearing price. And I also just want to emphasize again that because ERCOT doesn't have visibility into the types of customers that are bidding in, that we really don't have a way to say that that we're seeing a bunch more Bitcoin miners or not, or any other type of loader generator bidding in. It's we have a little bit more visibility into the generator types, but for load, it's really how big is the load, how much is it bidding in, and how much is it willing to bid in to provide, how many megawatts, and then does it meet the qualifications? That's kind of the extent that we have visibility there.
So with this being one of the halves of the show that I'm focused on is the Bitcoin mining component to all this. So I'd love to hear what are some of the ways that you guys are interacting with Bitcoin miners? And you can take that in any direction you want, but I'd love to hear like what kind of interactions are you having? Has that gotten to become more? Maybe just expand on that.
Yeah, and I mean, frankly, I think we can, touch on this topic and still kind of continue on the one we were just talking about. Because, we did mention ancillary services as being a way to provide demand response, but we didn't touch on the 4CP or just the passive price responsive nature either. And so, us at ERCOT, this introduces a peculiar challenge where we now need to basically enhance all of our forecasting capabilities, because we have these two other signals that aren't direct, derivatives of the ERCOT market per se, right? Where we now need to forecast for our load forecast to maintain reliability. So for price responsiveness, there has been an effort on our part, and also some of the miners have reached out to us to basically just open that communication channel and be like, hey, we're interested in your business model in terms of how that's going to impact your electricity consumption. Can you kind of just explain to us, what type of miners you're using, how price responsive you're going to be, plan on doing ancillary services or not? What is the ramping capabilities of your site, et cetera? So we have conversations that way, just to kind of gauge how they're going to behave on a day-to-day basis for forecasting metrics, and as well as for CP. We want to understand how they're going to respond to that, and that, as I mentioned, was the PUC program, which is essentially they their transmission costs for the next year will be based on their consumption for the peaks
Yep.
for the 4 summer months. So, June, July, August, September, whatever that peak 15-minute interval is, whatever their consumption then, that's what they get charged based off. So they don't want to be online then, essentially. And they'll have different strategies of doing that. It introduces some game theory there, right? Where, that number we cited, almost 3 gigs, 2 to 3 gigs of mining load. The last miner to turn off might be the peak setter. So, it's not as easy as just turning off on that 1 15-minute interval. You got to kind of play it out with everyone else. So, there's communication there just to better understand how they behave and how we can incorporate that into our forecasts. And then there's also some communication on the interconnection side, and I think Agee would be a good person to talk about that.
Yeah, before we move off of that, one thing I would also add to the point Evan was making about passive price response. In other words, watching wholesale prices and making decisions to reduce or increase consumption. That really adds quite a bit of uncertainty into reliable operations day to day, because we don't necessarily know which loads are Bitcoin mining loads, and we don't necessarily know what their strike price is. We have a lot of uncertainty, and these are very large loads relative to the system, and certainly relative to wherever they're located. That can come on or off the system in short amounts of time. That presents quite a bit of risk especially for maintaining the stability of the system. It potentially could drive us to have to, buy more ancillary services. So we talked about ways in which new entrants to that market might lower costs. Having to buy more of it is going to raise costs. So that's, there's a sort of a growing reliability risk there that we see.
Maybe, sorry to jump in, just maybe to clarify again for myself is, so what you're saying is that the fact that these operators are so price responsive to the power and to the price of Bitcoin that you don't know when they're going to be dropping load, and your job is to balance the grid, meaning you need to maintain 60 hertz on the grid at all time. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And, and I think it's really important to emphasize that price responsiveness in and of itself is not necessarily good or bad for reliability. If a load wishes to be price responsive and is willing to do so in a way that is coordinated with the needs of the grid, that can be really beneficial because it becomes a tool that's sort of a mirror of generation for helping to maintain balance and maintain load and demand in balance. And we haven't really touched on it, but we have a type of load resource that a load could qualify and register as, which is called a controllable load resource. And if that load chooses to, they can qualify and participate in the economic dispatch of the system, same as a generator. And in that kind of a situation, a controllable load resource will be incorporated into all the bids from generators. So it's free, basically it's part of the entire economic puzzle. So it no longer has to guess when prices spike. It's going to be incorporated into setting the prices and will be dispatched up or down based on its bid to buy curve. In other words, it feeds the strike price into the economic dispatch and is dispatched accordingly. its ramp rate, its ramp rates are accounted for, so we no longer have to guess how fast or the load is going to come on or off. And the controllable load resource is also eligible to participate in the ancillary service markets. So from ERCOT's perspective, the more flexible load that becomes a controllable load resource, that's really good because it brings those loads in and incorporates them with the other reliability needs of the grid. The more load that is passively responding to price, that really kind of negatively impacts reliability, because now we have to try and guess what they're going to be doing. We have to procure more ancillary services, which means basically like buying more insurance to cover that behavior. It likely means our load forecast is not going to be as accurate. It generates a lot of uncertainty, and we worry about the possibility that something like a generator tripping off for a mechanical failure, triggering a spike in the wholesale electricity price, and then suddenly we see hundreds or thousands of megawatts suddenly come off the grid in response. And what we kind of see that as a magnification of a reliability event, where we had one event, a generator tripping, suddenly become an event where a bunch of load leaves, goes off the system, and we don't know where frequency is going to be at the end of that. So it just, coordination, I think, is the real key to flexible loads becoming a tool for reliability rather than an obstacle.
I completely agree that. I mean, and what it sounds like is maybe just having those discussions about, not making sure, but just having the discussions about, having those loads be a part of that versus just competitively bidding. I was actually curious, and this kind of leads into this a little bit, is you see so much. Again, I live in this Bitcoin Twitter echo chamber world. Evan, maybe you're there a little bit too. I don't know, but what I see a lot of is how awesome the ERCOT grid is for Bitcoin mining. Are you guys seeing almost too much demand for Bitcoin mining in the ERCOT grid system? Maybe that's too broad of a question. I don't know, but I'm just curious.
Well, again, I think it's important to emphasize that we don't have direct visibility into the end use of the electricity for these loads. So it's difficult to say what. I don't even know how I would quantify what is too much, even if we could say, okay, this number is just Bitcoin mining. But I think it's fair to say we have seen a growth in large loads that are exhibiting price responsive, or other kind of flexible types of behavior. And the vast majority of that has been just as passive price response, so completely uncoordinated with the grids. Some of those loads are qualifying for ancillary services, and that is a coordinated service. But in terms of just their day-to-day operation, I'd say the majority, the overwhelming majority, are responding to prices outside of the economic dispatch. And as that number continues to grow, I think it does represent a reliability risk.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Would you mind sharing? So you've kind of touched on it a little bit. Are there other ways that this can maybe start to pivot and become less of a risk? Like, are there ways to interact with these large flexible loads in a slightly different way? Or, and again, you already touched on the one, but are there others?
Yeah, I mean, that's the primary tool. I mean, I think if we could, our preferred solution is for as many of these large loads as possible to become controllable load resources. I've already kind of gone through the benefits. It's, their behavior becomes coordinated with the grid. It takes the guesswork for them out of trying to respond to prices, because, instead of watching what comes out of the economic dispatch and then making a decision, you you feed into the economic dispatch what you would like your decision to be, and then that is incorporated with the overall needs of the system. And if if it's economic for you to stay on, you will be instructed to stay on. If it's economic for you to shut down based on the price, you'll receive an instruction to shut down. And that's in my mind, that's a win for everybody, because it takes the guesswork out of the loads decision making, and it provides ERCOT the kind of coordination that we need to
I think it
maintain
also,
reliability.
helps the Bitcoin mining narrative too, because most of the main actors in the space, most of the main companies out there, they want to be a tool. They want to help. They want to be a net benefit to the grid that they're on and that they're operating in. So it sounds like, this is kind of that. I would be curious, maybe this is a question for one of the Bitcoin mining groups. You guys tell me how you can answer this question, but I'm kind of wondering, is there resistance to that program based on, like, do they think that they can get better pricing in the real-time market? Is that where some of that resistance might be coming from?
Well, controllable load resources do participate in the real-time market. I would not want to speculate on what is driving that decision making. From the task force, we have gotten some feedback that there are some barriers to entry for becoming a controllable load resource, and there are proposals that are being discussed in the ERCOT stakeholder process to hopefully eliminate some of those barriers to entry. And I think it's our hope that will entice more loads to sign up for that, participating in that way. I think there's a lot of complexity that ERCOT as an organization doesn't have visibility into the decision making process. A lot of these loads are going through to make those decisions. But certainly from a reliability perspective, we think that that's the best way forward. And from an economic perspective, we think that it should be appealing to do that.
Yeah, just market efficiency in general, right? And I think, Ben, you got to look at the flip side, right? So, Agee talked a lot about the CLR program to maintain reliability through coordination, but what's the alternative there, right? If we are faced with a serious problem of very large loads turning off and on very quickly in a somewhat coordinated fashion, you have to basically limit that ramping of those loads. That's really the only way to go about it. And that's not in the best interest of price responsive loads, right? You want to be able to react to that 5-minute price print in 5 minutes, which is what you'd be able to do as a CLR. But anything other than that is it's too much of a risk to take, frankly. So CLR definitely aligns with a lot of incentives for both reliability and economics. If you really wanted to dive in the details, you could also talk about how that would cause loads to be settled, how that would affect their price adders. They would be settled on a 5-minute interval rather than a 15-minute interval. For any miners that probably be familiar with that topic. So it gets into the weeds pretty fast, but there are definitely more benefits for everyone, both sides there.
Yeah, it's like you said, getting into the weeds on that type of a discussion, and I'll be the first one to admit that's probably going to be quite a bit over my head. So I do appreciate that, and maybe we can do like an ERCOT 101 or like these types of programs 101, and I can go go into that more with you guys. I am actually just kind of curious. So obviously, Agee, you had like the best explanation of how ERCOT operates. You guys are kind of like the plane controller. You guys are watching, but you don't own like the generation. You don't own these other components. What are your guys' thoughts about, and this is, a little bit tangential, but your thoughts about Bitcoin mining co-locating at sources of generation to help with like generation? Have you guys put any thought towards that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Maybe let me clarify your question. So when you say by help generation, like what do you mean
So
there?
helping, generation. I guess there's a couple ways to, that happens is, and maybe it's not beneficial on the ERCOT grid, but um, just from like a monetization standpoint, if a generator has excess capacity, or maybe the transmission's really congested, and so the price of the transmission is not advantageous. I'm thinking like solar and wind projects that are kind of far away from cities. Maybe instead they buddy up with a Bitcoin miner, and that Bitcoin miner becomes a 25, 30, 40% off taker. I was just curious if you guys have started to kind of think through like some of those impacts on the ERCOT grid system.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what you're essentially
Yeah.
asking is a resource adequacy question,
Thank you.
right? So that's what I was working with a lot, um, and it's a little complicated, right? Because ERCOT doesn't have a ton of visibility into the specific financing of projects. We don't know who has a PPA with who unless that is shared with us by a customer. But from a theoretical standpoint, and high level, we are seeing miners co-locate with generation resources, and that spans from wind to solar to even natural gas facilities. So it's a little bit of all of them, and you're right. It can theoretically help in a couple different scenarios. So if we're talking new projects, having an off-taker already signed up through a PPA is a good way to help with financing. So maybe you'll see that project go through where it might have fallen out of the queue otherwise. It could theoretically help a distressed asset as well, but you have to consider these are all just kind of financial helping the generator, right? So if we're talking about ERCOT's overall system, if you have a distressed wind
Yep.
asset out in West Texas and it gets a Bitcoin miner that helps it generate more revenue, stay online longer, that's great for that generation resource, but it doesn't necessarily fix the underlying problem of that
That's
transmission
right.
going from West Texas to the load pockets, right? So you kind of have to have, you got to follow through, right? It has to address the main issue and not just the symptoms, right? Um, so it's very nuanced and situational. If that helps get transmission built, then you could say that's a positive. If a new generator gets built in somewhere that's not behind a constraint, then that could also be a positive if that generator wasn't going to be built otherwise, right? That would help your resource adequacy problem. But again, that's all theoretical, right? It's still way too early to say, at least from ERCOT's perspective, that that's having an impact. So maybe in a couple of years we'll have a better idea, but right now it's just an interesting thing we're
Okay.
watching.
And I appreciate that. And Evan, thank you for reframing the question in a much more concise way. Appreciate that. So guys, I want to just keep a tab on the time again. It is late afternoon on a Friday. You guys have been very generous with your time. I would love to maybe ask both of you to give your perspective, or maybe just paint the picture of like what would be like the most ideal future state for the ERCOT grid system. And I guess with the undercurrent of you guys are seeing such rapid increases in large flexible loads, walk me through like what a perfect futuristic ERCOT grid looks like with these big flexible loads coming on. Just I guess, do you guys have an idea of what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but coordination is the key to that future grid. And I think we're at the start of a significant transformation, both with all these loads arriving, but it's leading to discussions about how can we modify the ERCOT protocols and operating guides so that those loads can participate in a way. And it may lead to discussions about, I mean, there's already ongoing discussions about some market redesign steps. And I think for us, that grid of the future really looks like one in which load becomes a tool that is much closer to being on the level of generation as a way to both, maintain system stability and reliability. And, I think probably over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot of changes. We have a number of revision requests to existing rules that we've already put out to start to address these topics. I think that's just the start of the dialogue. There'll probably be much more discussion, probably additional changes that are needed as we get more experience in this new world we're stepping into. But, the grid of the future that keeps us up at night is the business as usual scenario where more and more of this load connects and continues to behave as it is today with very little coordination. But I think if we can get to a future in which a lot of this behavior is coordinated and integrated with the other generators and users of the grid, then that's a benefit for everybody in my mind. So that's the direction that we would like to head.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with everything Agee said there, and I'm going to split it off in a slightly different direction that's more focused on the large flexible load aspect of that, and we really have to see how this is going to play out, but it offers a very kind of interesting coming together of industries in terms of electricity and you can say Bitcoin, hydrogen, carbon capture, whatever else has its own independent market, economic incentives, to essentially, really try to drive down the cost of electricity through efficiency in the market. I know we can talk about the Bitcoin Twitter space, talking about that buyer of last resort and all that stuff, and I think that needs to be kind of hammered down and refined, but it has underlying theory that could make sense, right? I mean, if we talk about Bitcoin mining, I'm just going to use that for example as to talk to the show, as an arbitrage opportunity between electricity and whatever revenue you can make from mining Bitcoin for the equivalent units. That is something that will decrease as more mining comes onto the system, right? So we would expect that arbitrage to decrease over time. And so the only way to then mine profitably would be to acquire cheaper electricity. So in a grid saturated with that type of technology, we'd hope that it would increase efficiency of the market and incentivize more efficient, you could say wind and solar or any other technology type that could provide reliable, cheap electricity. And I think that could in the long run have a very interesting impact on grids such as Texas.
I love that. Thank you both for sharing the future grid vision. I'm super interested in people's perspectives on how they think it could and should look. So I definitely like both of the things that you guys said. And awesome. Well, guys, again, thank you. I always at the end of the show give the guests, some room for a handoff. I want the audience to either be able to get in touch with yourselves if you wish, or maybe ERCOT at large. So please give a handoff for the audience and where they can find you guys and more info.
Yeah. Well, I'll point you out to two places. So, should you have questions, feel free to reach out to info@ercot.com. But also, we have a large flexible load task force that I think we've mentioned a couple times, and that can be found on the committee's page of ERCOT's website, which is ercot.com. And that's where a lot of these discussions are happening in the public side of the discussion is happening there. So, if you're interested in following along or if you're coming to Texas and want to participate too, I mean, it's that's the place to go.
Great. Evan, I don't know if you had anything to add or if you guys want to just keep it at the ERCOT at large type of an outreach for the audience? A Twitter handle? I don't know if you guys want to include, if you even want to go there with it, but.
Are we still calling it Twitter these days?
Oh, I do.
X handle.
X, I don't.
Yeah. I mean, sure. So, I mean, believe it or not, I'm really not on Bitcoin Twitter. I try to avoid
Good
that
for you.
my own mental health. But so I'm going to avoid sharing that handle. But I'm on LinkedIn under my name, Evan Neel. Feel free to connect if you're in the industry. But then, like Agee said, definitely reach out to the ERCOT sources.
Awesome. Well, I thank you guys again. This has been a phenomenal conversation, great discussion. Really appreciate it, and you guys take care.
Thanks.
All right, thanks for having us.